Nietzsche warned us, but not in the way you think. Men have lost, not because women rose, but because men surrendered. This is not a war of genders. This is not about blaming women. It is about what men became. Look around. Men chained not by force, but by themselves. Power traded for comfort. Instinct buried under approval. Vitality replaced by obedience. Nietzsche saw this collapse long before it arrived. He saw men turning weak while pointing the finger outside. He saw them losing their will to power and hiding it behind morality, behind resentment, behind excuses. The figure of the modern woman is not the cause. It is the mirror. A mirror reflecting the emptiness of men who lost their strength. That is why Nietzsche's warning was never about them. It was always about us. And to understand what he meant, we must start where his words still burn like fire. His warning about the morality that kills the man before he even notices he is dying.
Nietzsche was not afraid of pain. He feared something else, weakness disguised as virtue. For him, the greatest danger was not violence or chaos. It was the slow domestication of man, the silent training that makes strength look dangerous and obedience look noble. He saw a world where instincts would be chained, where passion would be called sin, where power would be traded for comfort, and where men would learn to be proud of being harmless. This was the invention of the slave morality, a morality that glorifies submission, humility, obedience, not because they are noble, but because they are useful to the weak. Weakness envies strength, and when the weak cannot defeat the strong, they change the rules of the game. They invent new virtues. They call strength evil. They call weakness good. This is what he called ressentiment, a poison of the soul, the hatred of life disguised as morality, the revenge of those who cannot rise, so they drag others down. For Nietzsche, this was not a small problem. It was the beginning of a cultural disease, a disease that would spread until the very idea of manhood, the very idea of vitality, would be turned upside down. The man who acts is condemned. The man who obeys is praised. The man who desires is guilty. The man who suppresses himself is holy. Do you see the inversion? It is the death of instinct, the death of power, the death of man before he even stops breathing. This was Nietzsche's warning, that civilization, in its attempt to control and moralize, was killing the very fire that made man alive. He believed the human being was meant to rise, to create, to overcome. But instead, the majority would choose safety. They would choose rules. They would choose approval. And the cost of that choice would be heavy, because a man who abandons his strength will always look for someone to blame. That is the birth of resentment. That is the birth of projection. That is the silent collapse of the masculine. Nietzsche saw it coming more than a century ago, and today you can see the prophecy fulfilled in the man who obeys without thinking, who hides behind morality, who fears his own instincts, and calls it goodness. This is where the collapse begins. Not in women, not in society, but in the morality that convinces men to betray themselves. And once the man betrays himself, everything else begins to fall. Because the real destruction of masculine power does not begin in the world. It begins in the man who has already chosen to kneel. And what happens when men kneel for too long? They forget they ever had the strength to stand. That is the story of the domesticated man, the man who traded his fire for chains.
The collapse of masculine power did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, so slowly that most men never noticed it. At first, strength was feared. Then, strength was tamed. And finally, strength was forgotten. This is the story of the domesticated man, a man who is alive, but no longer wild, present, but no longer powerful. Civilization taught him that comfort is better than risk, that approval is better than instinct, that safety is better than truth. And step by step, he believed it. He silenced the voice of desire. He hid the hunger for power. He buried the fire of instinct under layers of obedience. The domesticated man is not weak because someone forced him. He is weak because he accepted weakness as virtue. Nietzsche saw this danger clearly. He knew that when men trade power for security, they lose both, because safety without strength is an illusion, and approval without instinct is slavery. The domesticated man looks respectable. He dresses well. He obeys the rules. He smiles when told to smile. He nods when told to agree. He appears civilized. But inside, he is empty. Inside, he is resentful. Inside, he is broken. Because every man knows, deep in his blood, that he was not born for obedience. He was born for creation, for struggle, for transcendence. The domesticated man no longer creates, he consumes. He no longer fights, he complains. He no longer transcends, he conforms. And the world rewards him for it. The system praises his obedience. The culture celebrates his harmlessness. Society calls him good. But Nietzsche would call him sick, a man who has traded his will for chains, a man who hides his impotence behind borrowed virtues. This is the tragedy. The domesticated man does not even realize he is in chains, because the chains are invisible. They are made of comfort. They are made of routine. They are made of approval. And so he celebrates his own weakness. He calls it maturity. He calls it responsibility. He calls it being civilized. But deep down, resentment grows. Because no man can kill his instincts forever. No man can silence his will without paying the price. The domesticated man envies those who still have fire. He resents those who still act with power. He despises what he secretly wishes he could be. This is why Nietzsche warned us. A culture that rewards weakness will always produce men who hate life itself, men who are alive but already dead. Think about it. The man who spends his life chasing approval, what happens when approval never comes? The man who spends his life seeking comfort, what happens when discomfort finally arrives? The man who spends his life obeying rules, what happens when the rules collapse? He has no strength left, no courage, no instinct, only resentment. This is the masculine crisis of our time. Not that men are oppressed by women, not that men are denied by society, but that men have accepted the role of the tamed animal, an animal who no longer remembers his own teeth. Nietzsche's warning was not a suggestion, it was a prophecy, and you can see it fulfilled today. Look at the man who bends for approval. Look at the man who hides behind morals. Look at the man who avoids conflict at all cost. This is not peace. This is decay. This is the silent death of masculinity. And here lies the paradox. The more men are tamed, the more they envy the untamed. The more they obey, the more they secretly dream of breaking free. The more they surrender, the more they resent those who never did. This resentment does not stay hidden. It grows. It leaks into relationships. It poisons intimacy. It creates the very hostility that men claim to suffer from. The domesticated man becomes the enemy of himself. And when he cannot face that truth, he looks for someone else to blame. That is why Nietzsche's vision cannot be ignored, because a man who betrays his own strength will always project his failure on the world outside. And that projection leads us directly to the figure of the modern woman. Because when men no longer carry their own fire, they will always fear the fire in others. And nothing exposes that fear more than the presence of the modern woman.
When Nietzsche spoke of women, he was not describing them as enemies. He was describing forces of life, forces that expose weakness wherever it hides. The so-called modern woman is not a villain. She is a revelation. She reveals the collapse of men who cannot face their own weakness. Look closely. A woman who is independent, confident, unafraid of power does not destroy men. She exposes men who were already destroyed inside. This is the mirror Nietzsche offers us. Not a reflection in glass, but a reflection in experience. The strength of the other always reveals the weakness of the self. The rise of the modern woman does not kill masculinity. It shows where masculinity has already surrendered. And this is why so many men fear her, because her freedom unmasks their chains. Her confidence unmasks their hesitation. Her power unmasks their submission. For the man who is whole, the modern woman is not a threat. She is a partner, a challenge, a force that inspires. But for the domesticated man, she is unbearable, because she reminds him of everything he abandoned. Nietzsche understood that human beings live in tension, between strength and weakness, between instinct and morality, between creation and obedience. The woman, for him, was never simply a person. She was a symbol of that tension, a test for the man who claims to be strong, a force that demands, do you truly carry power, or are you hiding behind excuses? This is why resentment grows, not because women are stronger, but because men are weaker, not because women have changed, but because men have forgotten who they are. The modern woman becomes a target, not because she destroyed men, but because she reveals their collapse. It is easier to accuse her of taking too much than to admit that men gave too little. It is easier to call her arrogant than to confess that men became timid. It is easier to blame the outside than to confront the emptiness within. And so, resentment grows. A resentment that does not create, a resentment that does not build, a resentment that only poisons. Nietzsche's philosophy shows us that the enemy is not outside. The enemy is the man who chooses weakness and then resents the world for showing it back to him. The woman is not the downfall. She is the revelation. She is the light that makes the shadows visible. And this light burns. It burns because it tells the truth, that men are not victims of women. They are victims of their own surrender. Think about it. If men carried their power with clarity, would a confident woman be a threat? If men lived with instinct alive, would a free woman be unbearable? If men embraced their will to power, would they waste time blaming anyone else? The answer is clear. Strength does not fear strength. Only weakness does. This is why the modern woman is hated by some, not because of who she is, but because of what she reveals. And so the crisis deepens. The man who has already lost himself now looks for someone to blame. And he finds her. But the truth is harsher. It is not she who destroyed him.
it is he who destroyed himself. Nietzsche warned us, what we resent in others is often what we cannot face in ourselves. And the resentment toward women is nothing more than a mirror of the resentment men carry toward their own weakness. Because when resentment becomes the only language left, it no longer hides weakness, it becomes weakness itself. And that is the beginning of total surrender.
The greatest collapse does not come from defeat in battle. It comes from surrender before the fight even begins. This is the tragedy Nietzsche saw. Men who surrender their strength not because they were conquered, but because they chose to abandon it. Rendition is not always loud. Most of the time, it is silent. It is in the small compromises, the tiny betrayals of the self. When a man stays quiet to avoid conflict, when he nods to belong, when he obeys without believing, when he smiles to be approved. Each time a piece of his power dies. Each time the instinct that once burned is suffocated. And eventually, he forgets it was ever there. This is what Nietzsche feared most. The man who does not even realize he has surrendered. Because the man who knows he has fallen can rise again. But the man who believes his chains are virtues will never break them. This is why obedience is dangerous. Not because rules exist, but because men begin to love them. They begin to believe that obedience is goodness, that conformity is maturity, that silence is wisdom. And in this self-deception, they lose their power long before anyone takes it away. The surrendered man is not free. He is not even oppressed. He is worse. He is complicit. Complicit in his own erasure. This is the collapse of the masculine spirit. Not an external attack, not a violent conquest, but a voluntary death of will. The surrender is invisible, but its consequences are everywhere. It shows in the emptiness of his relationships, in the resentment he hides behind politeness, in the bitterness he disguises as morality, in the despair he numbs with distraction. Nietzsche's words burn here. He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises. The man who has surrendered despises himself, and yet he still clings to the little pride of having despised his own instincts, as if killing his strength were proof of virtue. This is the poison. A man who has surrendered will call weakness peace. He will call emptiness maturity. He will call his fear humility. And he will defend these illusions with his life. But illusions cannot protect him. Not from himself. Not from the truth. Not from the collapse that comes when resentment becomes unbearable. Because resentment always returns. It cannot be buried forever. And when it returns, it corrodes everything. It turns love into hostility. It turns admiration into envy. It turns attraction into contempt. It turns life into a slow suicide. This is what happens when the masculine surrenders inside. He no longer fights the world. He fights himself. And in this war, he cannot win. The surrender makes him fragile, dependent, hungry for approval that never satisfies, addicted to comfort that never lasts, lost in a morality that promises meaning, but only delivers emptiness. Nietzsche did not warn us about women. He warned us about this, the collapse of men who willingly abandon their own fire. And once the fire is gone, it is not the outside world that kills him. It is his own emptiness that consumes him. This is the last step before nothingness. The man who no longer knows how to fight. The man who no longer knows how to rise. The man who has surrendered completely. And when surrender becomes a way of life, there is only one truth left to face.
The problem was never outside. The problem was never her. The problem has always been the man who chose to bow.
We began with a warning, not about women, not about society, but about men themselves. Nietzsche saw it coming. He saw the slow decay of strength, the celebration of weakness, the glorification of obedience, and today we are living the prophecy. Men blaming women for their emptiness, men blaming society for their chains, men blaming everything outside, so they never have to face what is inside. But the truth is sharper. The truth is brutal. The truth is this: the collapse was never caused by women. It was caused by men who surrendered, by men who traded instinct for approval, by men who traded creation for consumption, by men who traded power for comfort. This is the crisis, not a battle between genders, not a cultural conspiracy, but a spiritual collapse, the slow suicide of the masculine will. The modern woman is not the destroyer, she is the revealer. She exposes the weakness that was already there. She holds a mirror to men who cannot look at themselves. And this is why resentment burns, because nothing is more painful than seeing in another's strength the proof of your own weakness. But Nietzsche left no excuse, no scapegoat, no external enemy to blame. The enemy is always inside. The betrayal is always self-inflicted. The wound is always chosen. And yet, there is a paradox, because what collapses can rise. What is surrendered can be reclaimed. What is poisoned can be purified. But only if the man dares to face the truth. Only if he accepts the fire of life again. Only if he stops kneeling and remembers he was meant to stand. And this is not about hating women. It is not about fearing change. It is about facing the fact that the masculine power was lost, not stolen, abandoned. And Nietzsche's words cut deeper than ever. The problem was never the feminine. The problem was the masculine that chose to kneel. So listen carefully. This is not about them. This is about you. Because in the end, Nietzsche did not speak about them. He spoke about you.
If this moved something inside you, stay. We're building something for those who don't fake it. Subscribe, not just for the content, but for the confrontation. And if this left a wound, maybe it was meant to. Sometimes the best way to go deeper is to share the pain. Share it. Men lost, not because women rose, but because they surrendered their own fire. Nietzsche's warning was never about them. It was always about us, about the moment men chose obedience over instinct and weakness over strength. Because when you trade your power for comfort, you don't just lose the world outside. You lose yourself. That is the wound. And if you felt it opening here, maybe it's because it was waiting to be seen.